So good morning. My name is Gwyn Whittaker, and I'm thrilled that everyone is able to join us today. We're using a new platform from last year. Last year we worked with Chuck Carroll from Exam Room. This year we're trying the Zoom platform, which everybody is pretty familiar with at this point, sort of unfortunately, I guess. I just want to say I hope everybody is doing well and thriving. It's springtime, everything's blooming outside, and so it's a great day here in DC to get out and enjoy the sun, and we appreciate everybody spending time to hopefully learn a little bit with us this morning. I run the GreenFare Organic Café. We're in our 6th year in business. It's an educational restaurant that I started to help people make dietary changes and hopefully not just serve a meal, but change a life. If you're in the Herndon, Virginia area, you can stop by the restaurant. We're open for carryout. We have books. We're still doing our Kickstart program online, and we've had over 1,000 people go through that program now, maybe 36 doctors, and it's been life-changing for a lot of people. I owe my gratitude to one of the speakers today, Colin Campbell, who changed my life when I first saw him in Forks Over Knives probably 7 years ago, and read his book, The China Study. And I'm thrilled he's going to be joining us this morning to talk about his book, The Future of Nutrition, which is very eye-opening, I think, to things that are lost and also where we're headed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our diabetes project that GreenFare Health and Wellness did in December. And then Dr. Baxter Montgomery is going to be joining us, cardiologist from Houston, Texas, who's providing both paths. He's either treating people in the traditional manner of cardiology, as well as incorporating the choice to go into the food arena. So he's going to be talking about the food prescription to reverse chronic illnesses. So I'm very excited to be bringing this short and sweet program for you today. And if you like what we're doing, please consider making a donation to greenfare.org. It's allowing us to continue to do these projects that we're working, the Veg Fest and the diabetes program that we'll be talking a little bit more about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce T. Colin Campbell, who is a household name if you talk about cancer research. He's been in this field after a career at MIT, Virginia Tech for 10 years, and then Cornell University, where he's professor emeritus. He's written a number of books, the China Study, the Low Carb Fraud, a book that changed my life as well, the book called Whole, that talks about it's a symphony and not a piece. And then the book that just came out, The Future of Nutrition, at the end of last year. So without further ado, and my deepest gratitude, I'm going to turn it over to Colin.
Okay, I should start then now, correct?
Yes.
Ready to go? Okay, well, welcome all of you who are the listeners, the audience. I'd like to begin by giving a shout out to Gwyn Whittaker, of course, for the work that she's been doing for the last half dozen years or so, especially in the Washington, D.C. area, where we need a lot of attention. And with her cafe, I think that she's really done some fantastic work, and I just want to compliment her and thank her for the opportunity for participating once again in one of her programs. I've been in this business for a long time, as Gwen indicated, more than 65 years actually since I started my graduate research at Cornell University. And believe it or not, I really was working on this idea of food and health for the entire time. I learned a lot. I learned, first off, that what I thought I knew at the beginning of my career wasn't correct. It was a struggle for some years to come to terms with what I was learning. I had come from a farm, not very far from where Gwen lives, actually, in the same county. And just a typical farm boy, of course. So for me, what I gradually learned all through research, actually, for much of the first years, It's been life-changing for me in that sense. That topic here, nutrition forsaken for 2 centuries, primarily to focus on the idea that this whole food plant-based diet idea, from my perspective, is really a question that tests our understanding of the subject of nutrition itself. We've had a hard time really understand that subject, both professionally and personally and publicly, if you will, for, I would argue, for at least 2 centuries. And I'll mention something more about that in a moment. But let's start out first by identifying some terms that I'd like to distinguish, because they do get rather confused at times for some folks. We tend to use the word diet, food, and nutrition almost interchangeably. Therein lies the problem, because they are different. And I'd like to just be a little more specific about what I mean by those 3 words. Diet, of course, we all know what that is. It's the routine consumption of food over a period of time. And food, I guess we all know what food is too. But nutrition, I'd like to define that term as what happens to food when we eat it. In other words, I'm talking about the when we eat food and we digest it, we absorb the nutrients, and they begin to do their work in the cells and so forth and so on. It's basically the biological expression of food. So I'm talking about at that level, what goes on in the body, because therein is where I really learned my lessons, actually. Somebody shipped that back on me. Okay, let's try that again. Biological expression of food. Eventually, I'm going to put up front here what we all have sort of know now, but for me, in the beginning, this wasn't the case. I'm saying something here quite provocative that really quite excites me about the promise of this idea for the future. Namely, the nutrition of whole, plant-based foods does more overall to treat disease and restores health than all the pills and procedures combined. I know that's a mouthful, no pun intended, but quite frankly, that's really what I mean. I think we can begin to defend that proposition as we go forward. Yet at the same time, when we've reached this stage where there's a lot of consensus now emerging, quite frankly, nowhere is this information so misunderstood still today as it is for nutrition. It's really kind of sad in a way. Just to recall just a moment or two what I had said in the beginning about where I came from. I started out on a farm, as I say, just west of where Gwyn lives in Herndon, Virginia. I grew up on a dairy farm, milking cows, and that's an old picture of myself there in the front, sort of running a combine and earning some money to go to college and so forth. Went away to school at Cornell University, did my doctorate dissertation on promoting the consumption of more protein. And that meant, by the way, animal protein, more animal protein. That was consistent with what we did on the farm, milking cows and so forth. So I was all into the typical American way of thinking about nutrition, essentially. Then in my first position at Virginia Tech, thereafter, first academic position, I was given a responsibility of coordinating a nationwide program at feeding malnourished children, or developing a model for feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. It was a U.S. State Department project. There, we were expected to encourage the consumption of more protein amongst those children who, in fact, were malnourished. All of us in the trade sort of did that. There was a so-called protein gap in the world, and we were supposed to be filling that. So this program that I was involved with was an attempt to not only figure out how administratively and organizationally we can get a program like that going, but also to make sure they get enough protein. However, I saw something there at the time, thanks to this particular project here, these results here that came out of India, that suggested that if more protein is consumed, we might get more cancer. This particular study here was done in India, where 2 groups of rodents, rats in this case, were fed either 20% protein, which was the usual level, or 5%, which is the low side, sort of minimal, but nonetheless 20% versus 5%. And these particular animals had been exposed to a carcinogen that gives rise to liver cancer. And those fed the 20% protein, all of them, after a period of time, got the cancer. Those fed 5%, none did. An important point about this particular slide, for those who may not be too familiar with the science of this, all of these cancers were started with a carcinogen. So all of them had exposure to the carcinogen that caused liver cancer, but in reality, the only ones that did was the high protein diets. I found that really challenging and somewhat unbelievable. And in fact, the researchers themselves didn't quite believe what they did, and they went back and reorganized and came up with an answer that allegedly showed the opposite, which really wasn't quite true. But in any case, I had a challenge. Namely, we're promoting protein consumption among children, and we see this kind of thing. I'm seeing this kind of thing. I came back home to Virginia Tech, got some NIH money to start a program that, for that particular grant, lasted 27 years. Learned a lot. It was amazing. There was a lot of really fundamental biochemical things that just really penetrated my thinking in a very deep, profound way. I'm going to show you here just one or two slides summarizing that work. This is what happens, let's say in an experimental animal study, over the first 12 weeks, that when they're started off with, let's say, a cancer gene, a mutated gene, and then fed two different levels of protein. The same as what the Indian workers had done, by the way. I started out from what I thought we knew at the time. They get fed 20% protein. These cancers are growing rather well early on in the first 12 weeks, you can see. Animals fed 5%, cancer did not grow. In spite of the fact that both groups had exposure to the same level of cancer initiating gene. That was pretty remarkable. It was consistent with what, in fact, the Indian workers had done, and what I had thought I was seeing, in fact, in the children. The children in the Philippines, by the way, who were from families consuming the most protein, they had a risk of getting liver cancer, like what was shown by the Indian workers. There were few in number, those families, but nonetheless, it was an impression. So all of this supported those observations. 20% protein causes these cancers to grow, 5% does not. That's pretty striking, to say the least. Then we did this kind of experiment here early on, simply just to determine whether, let's say if we change the diet, the dietary protein consumption, would that make a difference in the growth of the cancers? And you can see 20% turns the cancers on. Switching to 5% turns them off, 20% on, off. That, again, was sort of proof of concept in a way. The protein was actually determining whether or not these experimental animals got cancer or not. It was not the gene. It was not the gene. And that's a really, really important point, because even today, the entire cancer industry tends to rely on the idea that it's really the genes that give rise to cancer. And that's what we have to worry about. It's really not true. They have a genetic basis for starting things off, but in reality, it's not the genes just lying there that causes the cancer, doesn't. We have to actually promote the development or expression of these genes by nutritional means. In this particular case, the higher protein diet turns on the cancer. So genes rather than, nutrition rather than genes primarily controls cancer development. Now, one more jump. I'm trying to jump through an enormous amount of work here, just 2 or 3 slides, so I hope I don't lose you. But the next question that I had to ask myself was, gosh, this can't be true, but if it is true, what is the mechanism? I was trained in biochemistry, and so I was really interested in to determine if you got a cause and effect relationship like this, we ought to know something about, does it really work? And so we looked biochemically at the formation of these cancers with respect to various and some different kinds of biochemical mechanisms, so to speak. This particular line here is a trend line. It's just sort of a researcher's scheme to study things like this. Over a period of time, cancer starts out with an early stage called initiation. That's when a mutation is forming. And then it goes to a longer period, in case of humans, maybe some years. These early cancer cells become, they start growing and dividing and become tumors, if you will, and cancerous. Eventually, it may begin to spread. And then finally, in the last stage, this is progression where this is associated with metastasis. So cancer initiated, then it's promoted for a long period of time, and then finally it begins to express itself, as you can see. So we look for mechanisms, and I thought in reality that we might find the key mechanism, because, you know, in theory, this is what we do in research. If we can understand basically what is the mechanism, which enzyme, which this, which that, if we can understand what accounts for a remarkable effect like this, then maybe we can make a drug. You know, we can put a drug in there and block it. That was the idea, and that still is greatly the idea even today, unfortunately. So we started to look for the mechanism, the key mechanism. Every time we started looking for one, we found one. This went on for maybe at least 10 to 12 years with some of my graduate students who were doing doctoral dissertations on this work. But we found, for example, that the high protein diet increases the rate at which the percentage it gets into the cell. We found that the high protein diet quite independently increases an enzyme called FO, increase the amount of enzyme that's required to activate the carcinogen. And by activation, I mean the carcinogen comes into the cell, that's the chemical, comes into the cell. And in order for it to cause cancer, it gets metabolized to a product, one of which is a very, very reactive product that binds the DNA, the stuff of genes. So that's really what the mutation comes from. Now, we have in our bodies all the time, and this goes on hundreds of thousands of times a second probably. But when we get exposed to chemical carcinogens, they get activated, that's the routine. They bind to the DNA, but we fortunately have in place a mechanism to repair that damage, because we don't want our DNA to be messed up, because if that is there when the cell divides, that's called a mutation. So the body has the ability to repair the DNA. It turned out the high protein diet turned all these on quite independently. And it actually decreased one mechanism we had as protecting us. I mean, there's 5 things right there, 5 kinds of mechanisms. Frustrating. Which one counts, if you will? And that's just during this first stage initiation. Then we turned our attention to the one on the bottom, as you can see here, that looked for some more so-called mechanisms. And I won't go through all these details here, but they're all fascinating. And so what we ended up with is something that I found first frustrating, but secondly, very rewarding. Namely, when we consume a nutrient, and I'm going to make a very generalized comment here, when we consume a nutrient, whatever it may be, gets into our body, that one nutrient doesn't come and just do one thing. It does a whole bunch of things, and it operates through a whole lot of different mechanisms. Hundreds of mechanisms, I'm going to suggest. We only just found 10. But a bunch of mechanisms that turns on those that cause cancer and turns off those that would protect us. That's the bottom line. And what really struck me about this is that there is no such thing as the mechanism. That was a very provocative idea, because that's what the drug industry counts on. Is basically, if we can identify that kind of thing, we get a drug and stop the darn thing. But in reality, we have just an infinite number of sort of mechanisms in all of our trillions of cells, all operating, one doing every one of seemingly doing each doing one thing, but actually they all relate to each other. And it's that constellation, that comprehensive effect of all mechanisms work together that gives rise to a vastly different view of what nutrition is. I just summarized here 8 mechanisms: increase, 2 mechanisms, or protective, decrease. And the high protein diet was increasing all these that cause cancer and decreasing these that actually protect us from getting cancer. So that was I can't emphasize enough how much of an effect that certainly had on me, because it gave us a very different dimension of what nutrition is all about. So I say your nutrition controls cancer development, involves not one, but multiple mechanisms. I'll come back to that and the meaning of that, because it's so profound. And even today, the majority of nutrition researchers and people in the public think otherwise. But I want to emphasize that nutrition is really about, hundreds, thousands of different nutrients, if you will, all sort of working together almost under a master plan. And when something goes wrong, everything goes wrong, more or less at the same time. Very important concept, which is exactly the opposite of let's say, the thought on the part of pharmaceutical approaches to solving problems, where they try to develop a drug to target it to a particular event. And that's what the drug industry is based on. Targeting, getting a chemical to go after the one mechanism that would take care of us. Unfortunately, that doesn't work that way. We can block out one mechanism at a time, and we can see some what looks like promising results in the near term, maybe for a little while. But in reality, the body takes over. Says, "Hey, I don't like that stuff. That's not the way to handle things around here." The body takes over and just sort of takes control of everything at that point. Okay, another major point here. Mind you, I kept running into what I call provocative ideas that sort of, in a sense, got me in trouble with my colleagues, because they, quite frankly, said, "Don't go there. You're going off the rails a bit." But what I eventually learned was that going off the rails was not a bad idea. Here's another one here too. I had been using casein up until this point, and that's a protein of cow's milk. And I think you can understand, for me, coming from a dairy farm, milking cows and selling milk, that the main protein of cow's milk turns on cancer. Wow, that's ridiculous. That was hard to digest, no pun intended, for a while. But I came back and said, okay, let's have a look at some plant proteins. And just a quick summary, a lot of stuff here I won't go into, but soy and wheat protein actually, when even fed at the 20% level, did not turn on cancer. Another striking idea. This is, as I say, 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And so it really, for me, distinguished the difference between protein of animals, let's say, and plants. Now, I just tested one animal protein, but just to jump ahead a bit, animal proteins tend to act like each other. So all the animal proteins are up to doing mischief, in a sense. The plant proteins, in contrast, are doing the opposite. Very exciting. Very exciting. And it applied basically to more than just cancer. It turned out, now I'm confident to say this, that the same sort of dichotomy, this kind of approach, works for other diseases as well. So protein. That's really what my story became. My ideas, for me, were different than what I had thought, and what was coming into play. I want to now turn your attention to a sort of add-on idea here about this idea of protein. We've come to worship protein almost. Protein from animal sources, that is. We've tended to say it's high quality, which is incidentally false. We've tended to make arguments we need to eat animal food in order to get the protein. Again, false. So it's all of a sudden this great wall of protein, this great belief in this protein idea coming from animals, we need to eat them to get the protein, is not true. It's simply not true. Now, well, that little background, I want to show you a study that we took on in China in the early 1980s. Quite a nice project, essay it turned out to be. It was the first research project between the United States and China, actually. So got a lot of play with a lot of different institutions, and was directed from Cornell University. I was the director of it, but we also had other major universities too, including Oxford University and a number of other organizations involved. And so what we were doing, the Chinese had established that for different cancers around the country, they were very high in some places and not in others. This remarkable maps they were producing. This is late 70s. This is so high and low for one of the cancers, breast cancer in women. We went to China to organize this survey in October of what turned out to be 170 counties all over the country, to find out why is it that for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, whatever, why is it that these diseases tend to occur in certain regions of the country and not in others? So the study was organized to collect blood samples, urine samples, food samples, all that sort of thing, and analyze them amongst all these people. And it turned out to be about 9,000 people, adults. So we had a massive collection of data that we could then begin to analyze, especially this question concerning about nutrients working together. And what does that mean in terms of whole food? I want to just show you one thing here, getting off track here a little bit, but I want to show you in reference to what I just said about the experimental animal studies, I want to show you the protein consumption effect in China. I want to show it to you in reference to blood cholesterol or serum cholesterol, if you want to call it that. We measure serum cholesterol in all these people across the country and Some areas had higher rates of heart disease and other areas dramatically different. I want to show you just by way of reference. Here was the range of cholesterol, blood cholesterol for Americans at the time we did that study in the early 80s. The low range is somewhere around 165 milligrams per deciliter. High somewhere around 270. Some people over, some few people under, but that was more or less the range. Average around 220. That's Americans. Here's what we found in China. Their high was near our low, 170. And it went down to this ridiculous low level, 90. I never heard of that before. The range was 127. In fact, when I was first seeing these data at the time, I thought we made a mistake. So we went back and analyzed the same samples again in Beijing. The first ones I've done in my own laboratory at Cornell, but the second one we did it in China. Third, we did it in London, and we got the same result. So this raised a whole new spectrum of thinking. U.S., we consume a lot of protein, and most of that protein is coming from animal foods. About 70% of it. That's why it gets so high. It's consumed from animal foods. In China, in rural China, they've consumed almost no animal foods, and so the range was 127. That was a big deal. So what we were looking at is what happens when the cholesterol gradually increases from, let's say, around 90 average. Some individuals even lower than that, but it starts around 90, goes up to 170. What are the factors that cause that to increase from here to there? And in order to do that, here's one sample of data that we analyzed that I thought was quite instructive. We had access to a lot of different diseases in China. Some of them were so-called poverty diseases. They tend to occur in poor areas. Others in the areas closer to the cities, none in the cities, just all rural, but more in the more urban areas. And so what I found was that the diseases that tended to occur in the more affluent areas, like what you have in the United States, for example, these are the cancers and leukemia and diabetes and coronary heart disease and so forth. These are the Western diseases, or sometimes they call affluent diseases. I'm not sure that's a very good name to attach to it. But the others are all, excuse me, these are diseases that tend to be communicable. These are called degenerative, age degenerative. These are communicable. And so I treated them as all the diseases in each list is correlated with diseases in its own list. In other words, they all go together. These diseases tend to go together. These diseases tend to go together. So that means it could have some common causes. So we looked for what the common causes might be. So it turned out the one measurement that we made that was most highly correlated with these diseases here was blood cholesterol. In other words, starting at low level of cholesterol, like around 90 up to 120, as that cholesterol started to increase, which always seemed to be so low, it was highly significant related to emergence of Western diseases. So what does that say? Higher cholesterol turned out to be a function of protein, a function of animal protein. So in these rural counties where they consume very little animal protein, they still just consuming enough cause those levels to start to go up. And that's when they started to see the kind of diseases we get in the West. So that was, I can't emphasize that from a scientific point of view enough. In other words, a small amount of animal food intake, very small amount, causes their blood cholesterol levels to go up from these really low levels. And that's when we start to see the diseases we get. Really quite remarkable, actually. So with that in mind, that animal food is so tightly coupled with cholesterol levels, and that in turn is cholesterol with all those diseases, especially heart disease. It turns out now, many years later, we can have a look to see how does protein consumption, animal protein consumption in particular. You see, plant proteins don't do this. Animal protein does this. So here's the human studies. These are all countries. We compare animal protein consumption with, in this case, breast cancer death rate or mortality. We see a really quite an impressive straight line there. That's a correlation. And that line just comes right on down. In other words, the lower the protein intake, the lower the risk of cancer. And if you follow that line on down, right on down, it intercepts right around this 0. That means to say, as soon as animal protein comes into the diet a bit, we can expect to see some increases in this particular cancer. That is really pretty striking, and that really was consistent with what we found in China, that low cholesterol level. You see, the Chinese animal protein level was way down here, like going 10% of what they were here and here. We could see an increase in these diseases in this low range in here. Same as what we see for the whole thing. That again was really a confirmation way, but it was so provocative. As soon as we start putting animal protein in the diet, we can expect to see, at least theoretically, an increase in risk for, let's say, breast cancer. But it turns out, there it is for plant protein, by the way, nothing there. But by the way, this is not my work. This was work done by a friend of mine, the late Colin Campbell, University of Western Ontario in Canada. He did this back in the 70s and 80s, just looking at intakes of nutrients versus various diseases. So it worked for animals, not for plants. So I want to make that point. So we're talking about an animal protein thing here. Here's breast cancer, another research group. As soon as the incidence of cancer is a little different than the mortality, this is a death rate from cancer. This is the amount of people who get the cancer. So as soon as animal protein is put in the diet, separate study, the incidence of that cancer begins to increase. Here it is for uterine cancer. Still another study. These are all studies of other researchers. Put a little animal protein in the diet, we start to see increases in these diseases. Now, I want to say something here. In this particular study, they measured total fat. And a lot of people think total fat is a reason why we get cancer and heart disease. It contributes some. It's not true. That's the argument that unfortunately has supported the vegan argument for some years, but I'm saying it's not really that pertinent. This is basically a marker for protein. Here it is for meat consumption and colon cancer. See it starting out here just like that? All these lines coming here, all across here, these different diseases, it shows that as soon as we start putting some animal food in the diet, measured as protein, we start seeing these diseases start to increase. Here's one for kidney cancer. There's been more work on this. You know, it's not just one thing. See what's merging here? I got my slide in my way here. So here we have one for prostate cancer. This was measured as skim milk intake, by the way. Skim milk doesn't have the fat in it. It's like a protein drink. So as soon as people start consuming more skim milk, just a protein, I forget what you call it, a slurry or whatever, prostate cancer goes up. Remarkable. Here's one for cholesterol. As people start consuming more cholesterol in the diet, which only comes from animal foods, by the way, as that goes up, heart disease goes up. See all these different things here, and this last one over here is for heart disease mortality. In this case, this was a researcher that did that work in the late 50s, said with percent protein. So what I mean to say for this sort of cluster of all these graphs, if you will, is that, except for the one that's plant, is that we see these lines going like that. In all these cases, as soon as animal protein starts to appear in the diet of these different countries, that's when they get the diseases, the Western diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, kidney disease, etc. So all of a sudden, it seems like to me we have a big 30,000-foot level examination of these diets and different diseases and the diseases we get. Really kind of sort of links Western diseases, cancer with heart disease and so forth, with consumption of animal-based foods. So it raises for me a question, it did for early on, that where did we get this reverence for protein? You know, we tend to think that protein, when it comes from animals, is maybe that's the only place it comes from. A lot of people thought that. It's not really true. Protein is available in plant foods too. But it was eventually considered to be high quality if it came from animal foods. And that begs the question, where did we get this crazy idea from? Because that really propels our thinking in a major way. Sorry about this, Mike. In a major way. And so I was interested in going back in history. Where did all this stuff start? And I spent a year at the University of Oxford at that time because I was working with my Oxford colleagues on the China study at the time. I wasn't working there in the 1800s to be sure, but I was there in 1985 when we were rounding up some of the data from China. And I got into the libraries to try to discover where did this crazy idea come from. I also was interested too, why was I getting such pushback? Really hostile, nasty pushback from the institutions. Because as I started talking about this problem with animal protein, I really kind of got it in the neck, to be honest about it, institutionally. So I got into the libraries to try to understand where did this really anger come from. I'll share with a couple of ideas with you. They're really quite provocative. This is a new book that I have, Future of Nutrition, going back and looking at history. I like history. History tells us a lot. It did in this case for me. Anyhow, in 1839, at that time, meat was being fed to dogs, as far as some scientists were concerned. And they knew that meat was necessary for the dog to live. So the story goes. And so they started isolating maybe something in it. They found that this chemical in there and that seemed to be required. That was the key to meat. They needed to give it a name. They gave it the name protein after the Greek word called proteos. That Greek word means prime importance. Here, these researchers at times said, wow, we now understand why it's so important for meat to be consumed. It's all because it's got this chemical called protein. So protein became, it almost got baptized in a sense as the lead nutrient, is what we actually absolutely need from thereafter, all the way through ever since the next 175 years, if you will. So protein took on this great meaning, and question is, why did they do that? Well, I maintain that in the 1800s at that time, there were scientists, and especially the ones who were better off, they were supported by the king and the queen, the royalty, if you will, who ate meat. Nobody else did much. But in any case, meat was valued as a very important food to consume. And the fact that they discovered protein and decided it was prime importance sort of meant they had discovered the gold nugget of that really important food. And so that's why they gave it the name. It turns out this kind of belief in protein actually was going on sometime before that. Here in 1810, that's about 30, 40 years before that, what I just told you. A certain William Lamb at the Middlesex Hospital in London, he actually proposed at that time that let's do a study to see what effect a vegetable diet has on controlling breast cancer. Mind you, this is before protein had been discovered. He just wanted to know, because he had about age 18, he had some sickness of some sort. He discovered when he changed his diet, he felt better. And so then he became a doctor. Then he had cancer patients. Then he got the idea that these cancer patients maybe could control how much cancer they get. And he got this notion, because of his own experience, eating a vegetable diet might be a good idea. He put a proposal into his colleagues to study that. It was twice rejected. This was a fairly distinguished researcher at the time. He was the doctor for William Bysshe Shelley, the famous poet, and some others. And so he was a noted doctor, but they wouldn't let him do that study. Just to study the effect of vegetables on human breast cancer. That tells me a lot, because what it says is that meat is so valued, is so treasured. The king and queen were eating meat. The everyday people weren't, but they would like to have had it if they had the money. So protein really became the byword in a sense. Shortly after it was discovered in 1839, the next scientist came along with some note, and this man really did have a huge name. He was a founder of organic chemistry and agricultural fertilizer chemistry, and he is credited with science being considered a materialistic kind of thing. He called this protein the stuff of life itself. So here's all of a sudden this new nutrient, protein's out there. Now it's being called the stuff of life itself. Still later, a famous German professor by the name of Carl van Voigt, sometimes called even today, the father of dietetics, which meant nutrition. He had lots and lots of students and colleagues and so forth and so on. He mentored many of the famous ones that subsequently followed him. And he actually found out that in one little study that we needed a man, in this case, he was working on a young man. He needed to have 52 grams of protein a day to be healthy, so to speak. But that's what he worked out for one individual. But then he came around, he was so enthused about this protein thing, he recommended everybody consume 118 grams a day, which is way in excess of what we need. But I'm only point that out here because he was so caught up in this idea that protein was so important, and only protein comes from animal-based foods. So that was the early history of protein. It was named very important. It was treated as if we had to have it, excessive amounts if possible. And one of the students actually called it basically protein is the interchange of civilization itself. So it went through the years. So anyhow, I got 10,000 more things I could say on this particular question. I just want to say that my general impression of this enormously complex field, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of studies being done, that when I look back, it's like trying to figure out, what is the most important things to say, and being very practical about it, where we get the most. And without defending it here, but I'm just going to give you my conclusion. Protein, we shouldn't have been eating animal protein, number one. It causes all kinds of mischief. But secondly, following from that, we should be consuming diets to get our protein. Protein is important, by the way, very important. We should get our protein from plant sources. And plant sources, vegetables, fruits, grains, and so forth and so on, they have all the protein we need. We don't need to consume animals to get that extra protein that has been so popularly said for so many decades. That's my point number one. Just as I said, I'd like to reduce my recommendation down to two things. So we need to keep in mind, don't need animal food, because we don't need the protein. Also, we should know that as we consume more animal food, this has been shown time and time again, as we consume more animal food, we tend to consume less plant food. So when we see these relationships with increasing animal food intake with some disease, we're actually looking at two things. We're looking at the effects of the high protein diet, increasing cholesterol, increasing heart disease, diabetes, and all that. We're seeing that. At the same time, we're seeing a decrease in plant food, which actually increases the risk even further, because plants have really good stuff in them. They have the antioxidants and fiber and all that. So one thing to keep in mind, when we get a prep, we should consume protein. Yes, get it from plants. The second one, and I'm not going to have a chance to get into this very much, interest of time. The second point I'd like to make, try to stick with the whole foods, where the nutrients are intact, everything working together. That's the key. So eat plants, sort of make basic. And I'm actually, I came up with that whole food plant-based diet back in the 1970s when I was on a government panel. And was that time that kind of information was first emerging. It was known as vegetarianism. I didn't particularly want to use the word vegetarian because it was prompted by different interests at the time, and so I never quite got into that. And so I wanted to use a term that was more relevant to just emphasizing the idea that we're talking about science, we're not talking about anything else. And good outcomes for the other considerations, but whole foods, plant-based, everything working together. Keep the nutrients intact. And that works turns out, when I wrote the China study with my youngest son, who now is a physician himself, he's actually, by the way, got under study right now, a research on a group of women with metastatic breast cancer, stage 4 women. It was going well until the pandemic came along a year ago, got suspended, and now he's cranking it up again. But this is the first time in like almost 200 years that we got around to organizing a study to study the effect of eating plants on something like women with breast cancer. And all the women in the study are basically stage 4 breast cancer women, very susceptible to, and he's hoping to see some nutritional effect. Coming back though, at this point here, at the time that he and I got together, wrote China study at that time, I was interested to go back in the literature and science and see if there were other diseases that sort of might be influenced like I was seeing in the laboratory. All these diseases fit in that category. All these diseases. Some of them are
about the food.
Pardon? I'm sorry? Okay, I heard somebody say something. But some of them are, like nuisance, I guess, acne, lupus, migraine, depression. Obviously, they're coming in that category, but some of them are really serious, obviously fatal. And so I say the whole food, plant-based diet, in fact, is broad. It covers the waterfront with all kinds of different diseases, makes us healthy. And surprisingly, it's so rapid. It's so rapid. I think Dr. Montgomery is going to speak next. I heard him say something this last day or so about the rapidity of effect. We've known this through some other studies too. Cholesterol starts to drop within 1 to 2 days. Blood sugar tends to drop in the diabetics. It's so rapid. It's almost like a medication. Let's say it is a medication. If the dietary change is sustained, it treats basically it treats illness across the board and does it fairly rapidly with compared to drugs with no side effects. Essentially no side effects. If there are side effects, we'll study them and have a closer look at them. But this kind of sums up, in my view, what the whole food plant-based diet is all about. One last little set of stuff here I'm going to show you. This wholeness thing that I get excited about was triggered for me by the fact that smokers who, this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, smokers were being shown to have less lung cancer if they had beta carotene levels in their blood that were higher. Beta carotene is a pre-vitamin A, if you will. It's only from plants. It's an antioxidant. Good stuff. Beta carotene is good. So what that research showed in the 1970s first was that smokers who had higher levels of beta carotene in the blood, that means more plants, right? They had less lung cancer. No, there was a nutritional effect on lung cancer of all things. So they got excited at that time that maybe beta carotene is the answer to things. That will block cancer. So they did a study. I say they, it's a US and a team from Finland did a joint study on 29,000 male smokers. What they did, they gave them some beta carotene in a pill, thinking that those smokers get lung cancer. That maybe that's a way to block it, you see. And so they were going to follow it up for 8 years, but had to stop it early, and I'll tell you why in a moment. The beta carotene in the food that these smokers were consuming, it was associated with less lung cancer. It was statistically significant. More beta carotene in the blood, that means they're consuming more vegetables, less lung cancer. That's quite a lot in that period of time for that strength of study. Here was the catch though. The beta carotene in the supplement actually increased lung cancer. This is a very important point to make. This really threw a curveball into the scientific community and medical community at the time. Basically, when a nutrient's in food, it tends to work, as it should, as it works with everything else in the food. When you take it out and try to stick it in a pill, no, all bets are off. Either it's going to have no effect, or in some cases, can actually increase and do exactly the opposite. So that's why I say whole. It's a whole food. Consuming the food, you can cut it up, you can dice it, you can cook it, you'll cook it, you can do all kinds of things with it. But the main thing to keep in mind when we take a bite of that food, however it's cooked and prepared and so forth, when you take a bite of that food, the body needs to have the opportunity of having access to all the nutrients in that food at the same time. That's the way it works. That's the way nutrition works. It's not, so I call it holism with a W on it, by the way. The alternative, focus on one nutrient at a time, I call reductionism. And one more just to add on to that, this is the kind of metabolism of reactions. This is a list of all the reactions inside of a cell. This is like 30 years ago, 40 years now. This is a million times that. But I put this here because what we try to do with drugs, we find one of those reactions. Let's say one right there. That's bad. Looks bad. Okay, so we want to get a chemical to treat that because we don't want it. We might develop a statin, for example, to block that enzyme. Let's say that's called targeted drug reaction. And so we take that one drug, hoping to get some benefit. Mind you, we're working with a single chemical. That's a drug, working some benefit. No, it doesn't nearly work as well. If it works, it's only slightly and has multiple side effects. That's the drug model. Here, I make a major distinction. In contrast, nutrition, which as a whole is everything working together, we're talking about multiple reactions like here. No side effects. See, when you bring in a chemical, I mean, you can sort of image in your mind's image, you can sort of see this, I think. A chemical comes into the cell, this is the whole cell and all that stuff's going on. It comes in there and you're hoping it's going to target one thing. Well, we do have some ways of making, targeted drugs. There's no question about that. But as it kind of slips through all this maze, through this forest of reactions, I mean, is it reasonable to assume that it's not going to cause some damage along the way? So of course it is. So the drug model of making health, it doesn't make sense in my mind. Once thought it did, but it doesn't. And it doesn't begin to compare. It doesn't begin to compare with what nutrition can do when you eat the right food. Everything works together. And then you add that to other parts of the body that participate in this sort of magnanimous sort of synthesis of reactions. I call it like a symphony. You got the nervous system, hormonal system, the blood system, the immune system, they're all working together. And that's what's really amazing about this nutritional effect. The whole food plant-based diet, it not only has unlimited supply of the right kind of nutrients, number one. Number two, as it comes into the body's adjusting all these different nutrients in a way that suggests there's somehow a master plan here. Everything kind of works together to create the response, and it calls the response for a whole bunch of different diseases. So I call that nature. That's just nature. I think when I sort of got into this, thinking about it with lots and lots of research along the way, I couldn't think of an analogy. Well, yes, I could think of an analogy, but for me at least, the thing that really mattered was nature. Published in a book called Whole. It's for me a different worldview from what we tend to think of when we think about nutrition. The China study, by the way, has done well. I was surprised. I didn't think that it would do all that well. It's now sold. It's approaching well over 3 million copies, and it's been translated into about at least 50 foreign languages. Whole, when it came out, it was a New York Times bestseller, done well too. And so here's my two anchors for the message. One, let's just consume plants. Number one. Number two, consider them in a whole food form. Yeah, everybody can stray a little bit now and again, I guess, or whatever, but this is the big ticket item here. They keep the foods whole from plant sources, mix and match any way you like. Zillions of different ways to combine those things. Everybody can have their favorite. Keep the ethnic cuisine intact. There you have it. It's just so I call this holistic nutrition. Multiple nutrients, multiple mechanisms. I mean, all this stuff here to me is like a symphony. One note and an orchestra doesn't make the whole orchestra. Okay, that's holistic nutrition. In contrast, medicine is reductionist. We always are thinking about one disease, one cause, one mechanism. That is the modern medical system. Very, very costly. We spend the most per capita of any country in the world. We use the most drugs per capita of any country in the world, yet we rank somewhere around 30th to 40th in life expectancy. And this is why nutrition is not taught in medical schools. Medical schools are reductionist in nature. Nutrition as a whole is a different idea. And there's no nutrition institute at NIH. And this is why nutrition is not considered to be a serious medical science. And therein, right here, I spent about 20 years in national policy development. I saw this from behind the curtain, so to speak. I know how these decisions are made at the institutional level. And nutrition does not have a good name in our system. It should. This is the major science in my view. This is what counts most. Just simply eating the right food. There's my new book, The Future of Nutrition. I'm going into some of the things I talked about here. What's the history of this field? How did that get institutionalized? Why did the institutions take on these crazy ideas? Why did we end up with the system we now have? I think it's largely related to the history, quite frankly. And we have one online course. This is a nonprofit that's with Cornell University that's been doing really quite well. We've had a lot of students in that program. It's great fun. We give continuing medical education credits for people in the medical sciences. We have different lectures, of course, in the study. And so, and all in all, I just want to get the message out there, as Gwen does and many others. And there's various ways of doing this. My little corner of this world is try to make sure that the science is right. And because I'm really so enthused about the science, it convinced me to change my whole diet totally, 100%. So thank you very much. Again, Gwen, I appreciate very much the opportunity for doing this.
Thank you very much, Colin. We appreciate and we're very intrigued by your continued message around the same message I think that you've always been giving, and it keeps getting reaffirmed by the newest science. And somebody asked a question about how do you get things to change? And I think the title of your talk that you shared with me was Nutrition Renaissance. And it seems right now that we have more momentum than we have in the past 10 years since I've been looking at this. And do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I've given a lot of thought to that, Gwen. We talked about it, and I get my impressions not only from the laboratory and teaching, but also working in policy development, where I can see how science is just translated into the public sector. I get three things in mind. Number one, medical schools should teach nutrition. Some medical schools teach some courses of nutrition, but it's not the kind I'm talking about. It's almost like going back to square one. They got to teach nutrition. Or I'm going to suggest a heavy-handed approach. Not that I'm excited about what government does or doesn't do, but government gives a lot of money to medical schools. They have a hammer. They can simply insist that medical schools need to teach good nutrition. That's where the health is, or they don't get further support. So, we need to be tough about this. It's going on far too long. So teaching medical students that, and nurses, obviously, other healthcare workers, obviously. That's number one. Number two, doctors need to be compensated for what they do in this area. And doctors pretty much compensated, reimbursed, if you will, for services, doing this disease, using that drug, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And according to about 130 different entries that they can target, it's actually more than that. Not one is called nutrition. Not one. So nutrition is not part of the discussion, not even an opportunity. And I think doctors need to be compensated for doing good work like this. Thirdly, the National Institutes of Health, which funded basically almost all of my research quite generously. And there's 27 institutes at NIH, one for heart, one for cancer, one for this and that. There's not one called the Institute of Nutrition. We had an opportunity during the last 2 or 3 years in the public sector talking about forming a new Institute of Nutrition. I've been arguing about that for some time, and I thought maybe it might happen. Well, they finally made a decision just recently to put a nutrition program into the director of NIH's office. That to me is a death knell, because the director has control of the budget, and the director eventually will control what kind of money goes to this program of nutrition. That's what they did before. That fails. So it's one more time, just recently, that I see evidence that the institution really does not want to advertise nutrition, because it competes with drugs. Let's face it. It also competes with the way we produce food as well. So there's three things. I can name some other things, but one of the big things politically is to do away with that Citizens United Supreme Court decision that allows corporations to buy votes, just to put it very candidly. And that's part of the problem. We're corporatized. And that means we continue eating the kind of food that makes us sick, because that's a big industry. And we continue to use the drugs that make us well. That's a big industry. So you take the ag and you take the health departments, politically controlled, where it's the wrong model. It's just the wrong model. So we gotta think how to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting whether the government is leading or lagging, consumer demand. And I went to CIA meeting, I guess it was a year and a half ago, the Culinary Institute of America out in Sonoma Valley, and they were talking about the global plant forward movement. And they were talking about health and the environment. And not only doctors, but chefs usually have very little education in nutrition. And so they were promoting that if you're a leading restaurant chain influencer, and you are not promoting a plant-based meals on your restaurant's menu, that you're falling behind. So, some of the consumer demand, I think, will catch up, and the government hopefully will step up as people elect government officials that are in line with where they see things going. So, it feels like the pace of change is happening quicker, and so I look at all the corporations now that are investing in plant-based foods, even though they don't have the word whole in them, they're still, they still do have the plant-based. So I see these things as steps in the right direction. So I think your foundational work has, culminated in where we are today, I think, with growing momentum. So I, continue to be optimistic.
Yeah, we are seeing changes. Got a ways to go, but at least getting the public to think about this and to talk about it in a rational way is a very exciting idea.
Today, it seems to be not as much people putting up objections why not to do whole food plant-based, but how to do whole food plant-based. That's been the reaction that I've noticed has been changing. So Colin, I want to thank you again for your time on a Sunday morning. You're a legend in the field, and I am deeply appreciative to your time sharing your knowledge with our listeners today. We are recording this, and I'll be sharing it out. And so, you're welcome, Colin, if you want to stay on. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about our diabetes initiative, and then Dr. Baxter Montgomery will be joining us to talk about his food prescription to prevent chronic illness.
Good. Well, thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. So I appreciate everybody joining us today, and I want to talk a little bit about the project that we started with the nonprofit GreenFare Health and Wellness. I mentioned early on that the GreenFare Organic Cafe has been in business for 5 years. We actually had one of our best years ever during the pandemic, which was, I think, indicative that people felt like they wanted to focus on food first and healthy food. And so we continued doing the Kickstarts via Zoom, which gave us more flexibility as far as where we could actually teach the classes. So we've had people from around the country join the Kickstart classes. And after 5 years of watching people recover from all manners of chronic illnesses, usually obesity, heart disease, blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. I decided in December, actually before December, but to put a program together through the nonprofit that would focus on 2 aspects. One was a specific disease, and I looked at type 2 diabetes because that's the disease that the hospitals don't focus on, and there's not really an industry built up to support. So it's sort of the low-hanging fruit that if you can make improvement in diabetes, then people are going to pay attention. And the second was the demographic that I selected, which was African-American community, because in time of COVID, people of color in particular have been sort of left behind and had the worst outcomes with respect to the COVID. So in December, we provided I'm going to show a real quick video that talks about the project, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3-month outcome. So I'm going to show a 10-minute video about the project, and you'll get to hear sort of the inspirational stories before and after the 28-day program. I do want to mention one of my close friends went through this program, and he was on the verge of starting dialysis. And today he's talking about taking a trip with his brother. And so it's just being able to watch people make these amazing changes was so gratifying to me. So please join me watching this brief video. My name is Gwyn Whittaker. I'm the owner of the GreenFare Café and the CEO for the GreenFare Health and Wellness nonprofit. Because the restaurant had been focused on education, the nonprofit was a logical extension to do really a deep dive around specific health issues that people had and focusing on the impact of nutrition and education. The first project that we've been working on is this case study on type 2 diabetes in African Americans. Titus Unlimited, he was having a discussion with Gwyn Whittaker, and it was about reversing diabetes with a plant-based diet. I was intrigued. My goal is to get to a point where I don't have to be on medication anymore.
To be healthier, but specifically with, losing weight, and of course that always helps, but to stabilize my blood sugar, because I'm on a path of getting it under control where it was previously way out of control.
I was first diagnosed as a diabetic back in 2000. Good and bad. I mean, there's times when it's been under control and times when it hasn't been.
My father was he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. At the time, he should have retired at 65 years old. He held on for as much as he could. I'm 60 years old now. And the doctor gave me a reality check and told me, again, my A1C numbers were trending upward. And my best friend who introduced me to this case study, it just fell into my lap, and I couldn't afford to not be a part of this case study.
Whatever I could do to learn about the diabetes, lower my blood pressure, reducing my cholesterol, I would love to learn about it so that I can remove myself from medication and live a more healthier life.
I had just gotten blood work back that said that I was pre-diabetic, and I also have high blood pressure, and I've had high blood pressure for 37 years. I'm 69 years old now.
I know men in my family have lived past 56, usually dying of heart-related stuff. I got myself checked out and found that I was diabetic.
I have high blood pressure. I have type 2 diabetes. I have now some kidney problems that have just been diagnosed. A lack of kidney function, loss of kidney function. And I'm hoping that diet can be a help to reverse some of these issues.
The organic plant-based diet that we use is low fat without added salt. That has a huge impact on blood pressure. You take out a lot of the simple sugars that people have. That's going to impact diabetes, as well as the high, especially high fat. Animal protein is going to be inflammatory, whatever type, whether it's chicken, fish, dairy. So when you take those things out, then people usually have very, very rapid recovery.
Never ever had a doctor recommend getting off the meds. If anything, they progress toward more meds. Generally, they will say lifestyle changes, diet and exercise help, but there's no guidance associated with that. I've tried various things in the past, mainly to lose weight. That's not my issue now. But this is the first plant-based diet. I'm the dietitian and the chef for GreenFare. The program is 28 days. So all participants receive 3 meals per day
plus a fruit per day. So this pickup is spaghetti puttanesca, black bean chili. You use just organic ingredients, all made SOS. SOS is the short for salt, oil, and sugar-free. So they are all plant-based, low-fat meals. You don't use any kind of oil or oil substitution in the meals, and also sugar-free. Not sugar-free in the terms of the food is free of sugar. You don't add any processed sugar.
So the 28-day program included both pre and post diagnosis. So we actually did blood tests at the beginning and end, measuring lipid profile, which is all the cholesterol numbers. And we looked at A1C as well, which is the blood sugar. Twice a week, we measured weight, blood pressure, and took photographs. So we had a lot of biometric data.
133 over 72.
What important is how you feel. I feel good.
At GreenFare with the restaurant, we're pairing not only the classes, but we're pairing it with food. One of the changes that happened with COVID-19 was moving classes inside the restaurant onto the Zoom platform. And each class has usually fairly small components of videos that we're watching. We have dialogue between the videos, and then Pericles actually does some cooking demonstrations.
Or you can serve of baked potato.
The way that blood pressure is specific to a particular point in time, cholesterol is a point in time, A1C is an average over 90 days, right? So I had expected bigger drops, but when I put it in context and I had our diabetes nurse look at the numbers, she's like, these are great, because you just measured it over really a 25-day period.
I'm a little lighter in my shoes these days. Not just the weight, but just the way I feel physically.
I probably dropped 11 pounds. My resting heart rate's dropped down.
All my numbers went down.
I think that my numbers overall, not just looking at the A1C, are all better.
I had an appointment with my doctor on Wednesday, 3 days ago. And he said, you're a new man.
I actually feel great. I mean, I have so much more energy. I sleep better at night.
I was able to meet my personal, goals. Cholesterol dropped by 50%. My A1C's down, and I'm excited to go to my doctor and show her what I'm working with.
Well, the last time I was at my doctor's, she did my blood work over, and she told me that she said she could take me off.
The blood pressure, I can see it, it came down. But the biggest thing for me, it was getting my A1C under control because I've been working on it. And it was on a downward trend anyway, but I could tell that this made a big difference.
My diastolic number, the bottom number, was in the 70s. And that's something that has never happened to me in the last 35 years or so. And I've been on all kinds of blood pressure medicine, and none of that medicine has done that for me.
If you're doing this, good for your body and your digestive system. I think there's a tendency to want to try to do other things as well. So I've been either biking for 1 hour or walking for a minimum half hour, 40 minutes every day, and meditating.
Now I find myself, after exercising for 30 minutes, I want to push myself. I'm like, okay, I haven't challenged myself enough to get winded or feel like I'm pooped. Whereas before, I'm struggling.
The exciting thing, I think, was the rapid impact, especially on hypertension, high blood pressure, that resulted anywhere from a 20, 30, 40, as high as 50-point drop. From a cholesterol standpoint, we saw up to 40% drop in total cholesterol. Then the A1C measurement, we had a significant drop across the board. We're going to be retaking in 3 months. So the goal had been not only to get people to be successful within a 28-day program, but also to demonstrate sustainability.
The results have spoken for themselves, and you can't argue with the science or what the numbers say.
I don't know any other way to do it other than from the things that I've read is to remove animal fats from your body, so that's just going to be my focus.
unlike anybody else that grew up that's in my age group, that's African Americans, I used to love pork chop, fried chicken. We are literally killing ourselves with food, and there is no food worth dying for.
The traditional African American diet is designed to give you diabetes if you are inclined to have it. Then you'll probably get it on the African American diet.
The downside of having diabetes, high blood pressure, and all the things that I was dealing with is that it drags you down health-wise. It infects your spirit, mentally, physically. I feel my, I don't want to say existence, but quality of life got better.
I'd say go ahead and give it a try. Give it a try. You don't have anything to lose. The benefits are documented everywhere. And you'd be surprised at how your body adapts and how you feel. And I think it's a good thing. And you cannot argue with the number. You can't argue with the science.
Want to know where to invest $1,000 right now? Hi, Rex Moore with the
So one of the most important aspects around this project that we did was not only to demonstrate that people can get better in a 30-day period, but that it's sustainable. And so we just completed the third round of blood testing after 3 months, and 60% of the people are still with the program, which is very exciting to me. In the initial 28 days, 90% of the people finished better than where they started, which is in the world of diabetes is extremely dramatic. So I want to ask your help if you're supporting these programs that we're planning to do. Please consider making a donation at greenfare.org. We're a 501c3, so tax deductible donation, and that'll enable us to continue doing these prototype work. One of the things that I believe is that the quicker that we can focus on different disease-specific turnarounds, the more impact that they can have. We're also working on a donation. We've made a donation to one of local food pantries of 5,000 meals from Plant Pure Nation that'll be combined with a local produce company. And that'll introduce the plant-based nutrition at the low-cost price points. So if you want to support our work, please make a donation. I'm thrilled now to bring in a fellow that has been in a number of the plant-based films. I had the opportunity to visit Dr. Baxter Montgomery in Houston, Texas. So heart of the bighorn cattle. He's making his own oasis, not only with a cardiology practice, but a focus on lifestyle medicine and providing people a choice. I remember walking through his facility, and on one side, people are going through all types of medical intervention. And on the other side, there's a cafe where people can choose healthy plant-based foods. So I'm going to thank Dr. Baxter Montgomery for agreeing to participate and turn it over to you. So welcome, and thank you again for participating.
Thank you very much, Gwyn, and thanks for having me. It's great. And good morning. I think it's still morning on my side. It may be afternoon, so good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. And I'd like to share my experience in using nutrition. And I've had a lot of conversations with Dr. Campbell, so it was a pleasure listening to his presentation, because his comments on terms of how we use medications and how they don't fit very neatly into our complex biochemical bodies really hits home when you're treating patients. And what I like to do in this discussion is the concept of food prescription is important to me. When I got into this field, I came in through the avenue of doing nutritional detoxes and juice feasting and that type of thing. And I saw the amazing impact it had on me personally. And when I started applying it to my patients, the patients I started with were people who were near end stage. You know, one lady who came to mind was a patient who had advanced diabetes. She had had 4-vessel bypass in the past, and since then she had had multiple stents. Her heart was pumping at just 10%. She was on 21 medications, in a wheelchair, on oxygen, couldn't walk with arthritis. And so, you know, this is an example of the patients I dealt with. And so, you know, they had little to no room. And so it was appropriate that I started on the more aggressive end of plant-based nutrition. And this particular patient that I described to you, I put her on a 10-day juice feast and cleanse. And in 10 days, she came back walking, talking, no oxygen. We weaned her off a lot of her medications. And so from that experience, or those early experiences, it's been a journey for me over the near 2 decades that I've been doing this. And what I've come up with is an approach that I think is really important. And this is really designed on the side of the clinical medicine side. So this talk, the food prescription for chronic disease, is really designed. I'll share my screen with you. Can y'all see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. And so I want to talk about how I actually use this nutritional approach in the setting of my practice, because my patients come in and many of them come in different conditions. It ranges from, you know, acutely short of breath to a patient had a cardiac arrest in the office and we had to resuscitate them, to a whole gamut of things. And so, you know, we come in from the most aggressive side. So there's a nutritional side to it as well that can play a role even in these acute settings. So first of all, let's look at what is chronic disease. And we all pretty much know this is an abnormality, a condition, a health condition, or adverse health condition, I should say, that's expected to last a year or more. We're familiar with the common ones: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, chronic lung disease, arthritis, chronic infections, and the list can go on. These are the major ones. But in essence, chronic diseases, I like to think of them as an underlying process that you're living with. If you're familiar with, you know, barbecuing, we barbecue in Texas, I give barbecue analogies, but if you have coals on the pit, you get the coals heated up, you know, you put them on fire and they're smoldering. So smoldering coals are hot, and hot smoldering coals is sort of like an underlying chronic illness. It's sort of smoldering. If you put a little lighter fluid on it or something, there's a flare-up. There's an acute reaction to that. So this underlying process, I like to think of it as 3 major components. As I alluded to, inflammation. Inflammation is like a biochemical fire. It's this underlying process, like I said, with smoldering charcoals. And many of us live with chronic inflammation. This diagram here that talks about the individual with back pain. Many people with arthritis understand inflammation from the acute setting because they, you know, live with it from pain on a regular basis. But not everyone has arthritis. Many people are walking around and they are quote unquote healthy. They feel great, but they have underlying inflammation. And inflammation underscores a lot of chronic illness such as cancer, neurological diseases, pulmonary diseases, bone and joint diseases, metabolic disorders, and the like. And so many of these ailments that we have, even though we're asymptomatic, are related to this chronic underlying inflammation. Oxidative stress is another component I like to think about, and this is akin to toxic chemical buildup. We accumulate toxins by many means, the processed foods that we consume, the EMF, and, you know, a lot of stress in our life. So toxic chemical buildup. And at the biochemical level, we think of it as free radicals. These are molecules that lack an electron, and so they are unstable, and so they bounce around and destroy tissues, at the cellular level. So it's akin to seeing an apple that oxidizes. That's an oxidative stress on the apple. At the cellular level, the cell breaks down. So we have this oxidative stress process that has an abnormal impact on our lives. And we talk about aging, and when people age, it's, well, my back hurts or my knee hurts, I'm more short of breath, I can't get out of bed, I'm just getting old. Well, you're not necessarily getting old, you're becoming more feeble due to excessive oxidative stress. So this is another important component that contributes to our chronic disease and the progression thereof. The other component is one that we don't talk about a lot, but it's a new area of study. And I put this in here, dysbiosis, or dysfunctional microbiome. Important to our life and our health are the microbes that live within us and around us. There are many more microbes that live in and around us than we have that we have native cells. And they play an important role in our diet. They can be affected by stress in our lives. What we eat, of course, affects it. And the biggest part of our microbiome is in our GI system. It has an important role in our immune system, but it has important impact on the cardiovascular system and other aspects of our health. So dysbiosis is a major contributing factor of it. And many people many of my patients have abnormal gut flora, which makes them not able to absorb nutrients very well. It leads to cardiac arrhythmias and many other things. And so this is another one of the major contributing factors to chronic illness that we have to deal with. So what I want to do is talk about the clinical assessment. I'm going to walk you through the process of me evaluating patients in the office. So someone walks in, what is it that I do on the clinical side, and how do I integrate nutrition in this whole component? Well, many of you have gone to the doctor and you're pretty much familiar with these things. They sit down and they talk to you to take a history and physical, and pretty much we do the same thing. This is really the most important part of the evaluation, because this is where I get to know the patient. So it's not only me getting information from the patient in terms of what the symptoms are, what brings them here, but I get to know the patient. They may tell me something about what happened last week at work, and I may find out what type of work they do, what the kids are doing, and so on. So it allows me to establish rapport, but it also gives me some insight in terms of what their life is, not only from the standpoint of the stress, the social aspects, but how busy they are. And all of these things play a role in the impact on their life. And so, are they able to prepare their food or not? Who prepares their food, and so on. So all of these things are impactful, and not to mention that the symptoms, the nature of the symptoms they may be having. We were taught in medical school that, once you take a proper history and physical, you should be about 85 to 95% certain of what the diagnosis is. And it really does work by taking a great history and physical exam. We get lots of blood work, biomarkers. Our biomarker analysis are pretty extensive. And we do lots of non-invasive testing in the office, as well as some invasive testing in the hospital on an as-needed basis. And I'll go through with you how we utilize these things with some clinical examples down the road. So this integrative intervention, first of all, we start with medication optimization and weaning. Dr. Campbell made an important point in his talk earlier in terms of how medication is, ideally targeted for a certain biochemical reaction. However, these biochemical reactions are very isolated, and it may not necessarily fit very well with the complex set of biochemical reactions in our body. In fact, one medication can cause lots of havoc in this complex process, that we are dealing with in our normal biochemistry of a healthy living organism. Now, so what we do is we review the medication list, we make necessary changes as needed. We'll try to discontinue as many medications as we can. Some cases they may need intravenous medications or intravenous fluids. So we make a number of attempts to evaluate the medication list, and depending on the acuity of the individual, we will also add medications, adjust doses, and the like. So this medication optimization is an important. The next phase is the food prescription. Now, again, after I've taken a detailed history, I got some feel for individuals who consume a certain dietary lifestyle. Many individuals come to me and say, hey, I've been a vegan for X period of time and my cholesterol is still high. But then I get into the details of, okay, you say you're vegan, exactly what are you eating, how are you preparing the food, etc. So we get into the details with a food diary, health assessment, we review the goals. I mean, what are you trying to achieve and the like, and we look at other approaches of their nutritional setting. Now, some individuals who are sicker, as I said, we get a whole spectrum. Some individuals may come in, let's say a heart failure patient, and I've had many occasions where heart failure patients come in, they're acutely short of breath and decompensated heart failure. We may have to start an intravenous line and give them IV diuretics right then and there and watch them, for several hours in the clinic, among other things. So we may have to do some minimally invasive procedures in the office. As I said, IV fluid lines, furosemide, and I'll give you some examples of some of the things that we have done in the past. We've done vein ablation therapies for patients with extreme swelling. So the clinic or the center that we have is standalone, and it functions as a miniature medical center, if you will. And we're about 4 miles just south of the world's largest medical center. So we're like the David with the Goliath just a little bit north of us. So when someone comes in, there's clinical stability. And I'm not sure who's the host. It looks like there are 46 people. I don't know if there are people trying to get in or not, but I don't know. It's if somebody can look at that. I'm just seeing a flashing come up there, Gwen. What we try to do is we try to determine the level of stability the patient is. I've had individuals come in and they're having acute pulmonary embolism. So, we'll have to assess them, call 911, get them to the hospital, start, intravenous anticoagulants. So assessing the stability of the patient is really important. So as alluded to, individuals who are acutely ill, immediate hospitalization. One patient came in and ventricular tachycardia. We had to admit him to the hospital immediately. I had a patient arrest in my lobby. We did CPR, shocked him into sinus rhythm, resuscitated him, had the ambulance come in, admitted him to the hospital immediately. But even in levels of this acuity, the nutritional intervention does not take a back seat. In fact, my argument is that patients this acutely ill, the nutrition is most important because it has to be integrated with everything else that we're doing. And we'll talk about that in the setting of some patients that we'll present. The chronically ill but compromised. So these may be individuals who are a little short of breath. Some of the heart failure patients I talked about. We may give them intravenous diuretics. If they turn around, then we will see them within a day or two in the office and follow them very closely on the outpatient basis. And if they don't respond to that, then we'll admit them to the hospital on a less emergent basis, but an urgent basis. Then there's clinically ill patients who are stable with mild symptoms. We do outpatient visits, but these outpatient visits are pretty frequent. We see patients as frequently as every day or every other day or weekly. As frequently as they need to be seen in our center, we will see them until they're stable with their condition. And of course, the clinically ill individuals without symptoms, we have a little bit more leeway to go with these patients, and it's sort of an elective outpatient visit. Now, let me talk to you about the food intervention. We talked about this concept of food prescription. We use a food classification system. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details, but in essence, it's a means of assigning foods according to their health ability, their ability to improve optimal biochemical and physiological function. There's a 0 to 10 classification system. Level 0 is the healthiest, level 10 is the least healthy. The healthy plant-based components are from 0 to 6. We arrive at the classification based on 5 characteristics: the source of origin of the foods, whether they're organically grown or wild harvested, the conditions of development, the level of processing with a lot of chemical additives added to them. What are their basic chemical characteristics? How hydrating are they? And what effects do they have to the human body? So why the food classification system? Well, The benefits of this system is that it provides a structured nutrition plan. I've had lots of patients come and say, wow, this makes things much easier for me. Are you eating at level 0, level 0 to 4B, level 0 to 6? And it allows the patient to have a structured plan, and we have foods in these categories. It goes beyond the usual calorie counting and portion measuring, and it allows for measuring compliance. So if someone's been eating levels 0 to 3 for a certain percentage of the time versus 7+ for a certain percentage of the time, we can measure the effects of those that level of compliance. It allows for evaluating efficacy, and again, it provides for therapeutic precision. Now, this is a busy slide. In part, I have it there. If you can take a picture, you're going to look back later. But I show this is an example of how we actually prescribe food, because we use intermittent fasting protocols along with our food level. So position 1 here denotes the time duration of feasting. This is the time that you're eating. Position 2 denotes the duration of fasting hours. The position 3 right here denotes the days of intermittent fasting. So if there are days that you're doing intermittent fasting, that's that number of days. And then the other position denotes the days where foods are consumed during feasting periods. So you may have an intermittent fasting period for 5 days and then 2 days of feasting the whole time. And then you may have, you may be eating at 0 to 4 during the feasting time, 0 to 4B here. And then during this time, you're eating at food level 0. So the feasting time, fasting time, intermittent fasting time, and fasting level. So let's say for someone is eating, position 1 denotes the duration of feasting hours. So for 4 hours, they're feasting. For 20 hours, they're fasting. So they're doing intermittent fasting 5 days a week, and they're doing 4 hours of feasting, and the fasting is for 20 hours. And then 2 days of the week, they're fasting totally. So this is 100% fasting. This is intermittent fasting. So a 4-25-2 is that they're feasting for 4 hours, 5 days a week at food level 0 to 4B. The remaining 20 hours of that day is just water or sleep. And that's for 5 days of the week. And then 2 days a week, they're 100% water. A 4-27-0 with 0 parentheses is 4 hours of feasting. And during that feasting hours, they're just feasting on just juices, cold pressed juices or smoothies. 20 hours just water. That's 7 days they're doing the intermittent fasting. There are no days of 100% fasting. So that's just 2 examples of how we will prescribe food. And the sicker the patient, the more aggressive it is. And it depends on the health condition as to what level that they get and what levels they eat, so on and so forth. But I thought I'd give you a little bit of a taste in terms of how we prescribe foods and the level that we provided. We do use supplements in a targeted fashion. So for instance, we start with superfoods. Now, superfoods are not supplements in a way that you traditionally think of supplements that are extracted vitamins and minerals. Superfoods, we use a blue-green algae. Wheatgrass could be thrown in this category. We use a lot of freeze-dried superfood powders that has organic broccolis and kales, and as well as algae and spirulina and things like that in it. So it's a mixture of freeze-dried superfoods. Sea moss is another example of sea vegetables. Other sea vegetables we also use as superfood supplements that we recommend. Methylsulfonomethane is another element that we recommend as elemental sulfur, which decreases inflammation. It enhances the production of glutathione. We also utilize a liposomal vitamin C. We utilize this especially in our cancer patients, but many of our other patients where we want to reduce oxidative stress and reduce inflammation. We also use a liposomal curcumin in individuals with lots of inflammation, lots of arthritic pain and symptoms. I'm treating a patient with advanced lupus who also has advanced heart disease. So when we have these systemic inflammatory conditions with an end organ function, I'm using some of these to help reduce inflammation and oxidative stress. Liposomal coenzyme Q10 we use especially in our heart failure patients to a great degree, and I'll share a little bit with you in terms of how we use that in conjunction with raw diet. So in essence, collectively, they reduce inflammation and oxidative stress and enhance cellular function, especially in the context of the coenzyme Q10, as well as in the context of, say, the MSM of methylsulfonomethane, which helps glutathione production. Clinical intervention of medications. We have a medication optimization / weaning protocol. So when I'm seeing someone and I'm starting them on a detox, I'll look at the medication list, and we're pretty aggressive about weaning medications. At the very top, I look at, non-prescription vitamins and supplements. Many people get supplements from over the counter, even many that may come from some health food stores. They're not optimal. They're more detrimental than beneficial, as Dr. Campbell alluded to. So we remove those supplements and we try to apply supplements in a targeted fashion, more of a global fashion, not just, vitamin this, vitamin that, and so on. We remove diuretics. Oftentimes people are very dehydrated. Many of our patients are more thirsty than they are sick. And so diuretics, which are used as antihypertensives or used for decreasing swelling, we often reduce these or remove them. And I'll have a case example showing you the effects of excessive diuretics in one patient. Insulin, sulfonylureas, these agents are also removed. And when we start someone on a detox, we almost always will stop scheduled insulin doses and put them on an as-needed insulin regimen. And we'll follow them up every 3 days by phone or once a week in the office. And rarely do they have to, go back on the insulin regimen if they follow the regimen. We do this for a safety reason, because hypoglycemia is a real problem, a potential problem in this setting. Week 1, so this is after the first week of detox. We evaluate them and we look at blood pressure. We may reduce diuretics even more. Calcium channel blockers, vasodilators, and other blood pressures are reduced here to avoid hypertension. Blood pressure fluctuates up and down, and blood pressure doesn't give a clean drop, but some of the data I'll show you shows the blood pressure takes an initial drop, it plateaus, and the diastolic blood pressure then goes up a little bit by week 3 and then comes back down. And this could vary from person to person, but I think the blood pressure fluctuations are in part related to detox reactions that are going on that has physiological effects as well. By week 2, the second week of detox, we start to wean other medications. Proton pump inhibitors, sometimes we may wean those early on. NSAIDs, we may wean them early on, or we may wean them later on. If they have bad arthritis, we'll start them on a liposomal curcumin, and then maybe wean the NSAIDs week 1 or week 2. Steroid medications, we try to wean those as rapidly as possible. Inhalers go almost any time, but usually by week 2, they're out of the regimen. And then by week 3 and 4, we continue to make medication weaning changes. Now, the medication weaning is very important. We talk about detox, removing the toxic foods, removing dead animal flesh, removing the processed carbohydrates and the chemicalized foods with preservatives and the like. That's very important. But removing the medication is also very important, because oftentimes I ask myself, are they getting better because they're eating better, or are they getting better because they're coming off these medications? And that would be an interesting study to carry out, because I think the medications in many cases, because it's not unusual for us to have a patient come in 20, 30, 40 medications. And we're not sure how much they're taking. They're taking some things every now and then, some things they're taking more consistently. But the medication weaning is a very, very important part, because many individuals are sick because there's so many medications and not for other reasons. So sometimes people require more invasive things. There are a lot of things that we do in the office here. As I said, we give intravenous fluids here. We do certain vein ablation procedures and other minor procedures in the office as needed. And then, of course, sometimes patients need to be hospitalized for more invasive therapies, either by myself, less so by myself now. But many of my colleagues that I refer these patients to, if they need, open heart surgery or valvular procedure, device implants, many individuals may need this as part of their adjunct therapy. So let me get into some clinical examples, because I think this helps bring all this together. So I wanted to put all of this information in the context of a conceptual platform, but let's try to apply this. So in case 1, we had a 65-year-old man who had known heart disease who came to see us. He had just been in the emergency room, and he had chest discomfort, and they, did cardiac enzymes. He wasn't having a heart attack, but he clearly was worse, at the time. So they discharged him from the emergency room, said, see your cardiologist as soon as possible. His heart was weak. His ejection fraction, which is the percent of blood that the heart squeezes with each contraction, was about 35 to 40%. It should be about 55 to 60%. He was having chest discomfort at rest and minimal activity. So what we did is we intervened by, making medication adjustments, and we put him on a nutritional detox. He went on food level 0 to 4B. And this is what we see. So what I want to do in this particular example is show one biomarker. We track a lot of biomarkers, but I don't want to confuse the picture. The reason I'm emphasizing this one biomarker is I want to show you how rapid these changes occur in the setting with these troponin levels. So what we see here is, hold on one second here. Okay, what we see here is the troponin level is 28.0. Now, troponin, as it's pointed out here, is really a complex of 3 regulatory proteins. It exists in skeletal and cardiac muscle as part of the contractile component of the muscle. And when the heart muscle is under stress or the muscle cells are dying, troponin is released. And so the troponin levels are elevated. So if you've ever been to the emergency room and you have chest pain, they draw your blood. Oftentimes they're checking troponin levels. They also check, CKMB and CK levels as well. But the troponin levels are thought to be more specific for myocardial damage. But in the hospital, they check it at a concentration of nanograms per ml. And here in the office, we check it at a much lower level at picograms per ml. And so if he had his blood drawn in the hospital, the troponin level would be quote unquote negative because they're drawing it at a less sensitive measurement level. But in the office, we're looking for not a heart attack, but we're looking for myocardial stress. So at 28 picograms per ml, we know that above 10, there's a significant risk of adverse events over time if your troponin level is at 10 or greater. So what we try to do is get it below 10. So day 1, before the detox, it was 28.0 picograms per ml. After the first week of detox, it went down to 5.7. After the second week, it stayed there, but then he was still on the glipizide, and he was taking his glipizide for his diabetes, and we discontinued the glipizide after we saw the troponin level of 14. Glipizide can worsen ischemia, shown in rat models, and so we discontinued the glipizide, and the troponin came back down. So just to show this graphically, a major drop, and then within a few days it went up. We stopped the glipizide and so forth, and it stayed below this magical 10 level. And so this is really important because this is largely the effect of the nutritional detox. And what I want to emphasize is that within 7 days, we had a drastic drop, reduction in this biomarker that's a sign of myocardial stress. So what I want to point out is that within days, we start to see major effects in the biochemistry of the body, and we can also see major improvements in the clinical change. So in this patient, reduction in the troponin was correlated well with clinical improvement. He had reduced chest pain, reduced shortness of breath, and improved energy level, all within this 4-week period of time. He started noticing improvement in symptoms within the first week, and it continued to get better. Case number 2 is a 60-year-old man who came in who was quite ill. So he presented, in fact, his doctor called me that day and said, look, can you see Mr. So-and-so? He's not looking very good. And so we agreed to see him that day. We, got the insurance verified, got him into the office. And so what we saw was that, he was taking metformin, and he reported having, fasting blood sugars in the low 200s. His last hemoglobin A1C was 7.8 by his report. Vital signs, BMI was 50, blood pressure 170 over 111, heart rate 122. And he was just not looking good. So in essence, we had to admit him. We admitted him to the local hospital. An EKG showed him to be an atrial flutter. I'll show this. I'm not going to try to have an EKG reading class here, but you have this sawtooth pattern in the 2-3 and AVF. It's a classic, typical counterclockwise flutter. And this is an abnormal heart rhythm where the upper chamber is beating very rapidly and the rhythm is irregular. And so the abnormal rhythm caused the heart to beat less efficiently. So his cardiac output, meaning his circulation, was down because of this abnormal heart rhythm. So we had to admit him to the hospital. His kidney function, creatinine, was very high, 3.25. And over the course of our treatment, now these are not exact days, I'm sorry, these are points on the curve, but this is not uniform. The creatinine came down. That corresponds with an improvement of renal function. The GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. That's the rate in which the kidneys filter the blood. And the higher the filtration rate, the better the kidney function. So we saw that a filtration rate just above 20, with above 60, at least above 60 is normal, should be above 90 really. But it was almost only a third of that. It went up to nearly normal in just a short period of time. This is a course of about a couple of weeks, just FYI. So I didn't have the dates on here. And so now the interesting thing, so there's this, as Dr. Campbell pointed out, there's this whole, a religious belief in, protein. And so here's an individual who presented, and his albumin level. Now, albumin is the major protein that we measure in the blood. There are other proteins we can measure. There are other ways to assess protein levels. You can look at coagulation and various things. But albumin is a very straightforward way. So his serum albumin level was about 1.7. A normal albumin level is about 4. So it's off the chart here. So he came in, of course, on a protein-rich diet. And by the way, he was a businessman. He owned a barbecue place here in town. And but his protein level was low, 1.7. And so this is where we started him on the detox on, so-called rabbit food, or grass and water, if you will, food levels 0 to 4B. And we actually kept him on that detox regimen in the hospital as well. The hospital knows about my nutrition plan. So over the course of a couple of weeks, his protein level on raw fruits and vegetables went from 1.7 to nearly 3. And so it improved on the plant-based diet, which also correlated with an improvement of his inflammation. Now I'm gonna make a few comments on why that's so in a minute. The other thing is that when he came out of the hospital, somewhere between here and there, this is by week 4, beyond week 4, he regressed. He had some oyster soup or some gumbo and something with animal protein in it. So this is the coming in on animal protein, then on plant protein, the protein albumin went up. Then went back on animal protein, the albumin went down. Then it went back on plant. I put him on a smoothie feast and the protein went back up. So the protein, when he ate protein, the protein went down. When he ate plant foods, the protein went up. When he ate animal protein, again, the protein came back down. And when he ate plant foods, the protein came up. So why is that? Protein deficiency, quote unquote, in the United States is rarely due to people who are not eating. I mean, I don't know, even the homeless people are eating. People are eating. And so I guess to have true protein deficiency, if you eat nothing, then you can have protein deficiency. But we see low protein in my experience for 2 major reasons. There's a third that's also, say, a distant third, but the first one is increased inflammation. When you have increased inflammation in the blood vessels, the capillary windows open and albumin leaks out of the blood. And so you leak protein out and you have a lot of swelling. This gentleman came in with lots of swelling. So he had systemic inflammation, again, one of the underlying mechanisms of chronic disease, which led to protein leak, which led to swelling. That's number 1. Number 2, the other significant reason that people are deficient in protein is because of liver dysfunction. When people say, okay, where do you get your protein on a plant-based diet? Well, I get it from a liver, because the liver is a major manufacturing organ of the body, and protein is one of the major components of what it manufactures. It manufactures lots of enzymes, antibodies, the whole gamut of things, precursor antibodies, and the whole gamut of things are manufactured in the liver. And so if the liver is dysfunctional, and many people have fatty liver for lots of reasons, not just alcohol consumption, but polypharmacy can lead to lots of fatty liver over consumption of processed foods, because all of these chemicals have to be processed by the liver. When the liver is overtaxed, the liver becomes compromised, so it's not able to function normally. Protein production is one of those things. And so in his case, it was inflammation. So when he got on the raw plant diet, inflammation went down, as our data will show you. When he got back on animal protein, or dead animal flesh, as I say, the inflammation increased and the protein leaked and it dropped. Got back on the raw plant-based diet, inflammation went down, protein was maintained. So here's a clear example of how adversely dead animal flesh or animal protein consumption can lead to protein reduction, even though you think you're trying to increase the protein. So in summary, we were able to reduce his medication by 50%, corrected his heart rhythm. We had to do a cardioversion in the hospital. His leg swelling went down when the protein went up, the inflammation went down, the swelling went down, improvement of the albumin levels, and also improvement of his overall clinical well-being. So this again shows how effective a nutritional regimen. This happened in a matter of days to weeks. Case 3 is a pretty significant situation. A gentleman who had flown into our facility from the East Coast. He had congestive heart failure, type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, was short of breath, fatigue, had a very low ejection fraction, thought it was less than 20%, which is very, very low. So the clinical history, again, previous stroke, hyperlipidemia, type 2 diabetes. He had a single chamber ICD. ICD stands for implantable cardioverter defibrillator. Patients with congestive heart failure get these implantable defibrillators. The SCUT HEP data showed it prolonged survival due to reduction in sudden death. And he was seen by his cardiologist. Now, this was during the COVID time. We saw him during COVID. He had not seen a physician in about 8 months. However, the last time he saw his cardiologist, he said, look, there's not more we can do for you. You need to put you on the transplant list. You're going to need an LVAD. You may need a biventricular pacing device, and you'll need a transplant. But he, nothing was explained to him, and he really wanted another answer to this, and so he came to see us. Here's the medication list. So 13 medications. Now, he had not seen a physician in about 8 months. He was on allopurinol for his gout, magnesium. He was on carvedilol. This is the heart medications that we call it a beta blocker. Trogentas for diabetes. Eliquis, a blood thinner. He was on Entresto, a heart failure medication. We were actually involved in some of the clinical trials back in my institution years ago for Entresto. Torsemide was a diuretic. Now, this is a very large dose of this diuretic. I want you to keep that in mind, because that's an important aspect of this clinical presentation. He was on a statin drug. Statins, by the way, and he's not on coenzyme Q10, they have an adverse effect on coenzyme Q10, and therefore has an adverse effect on mitochondria of the cells. And the mitochondria is it manufactures a lot. It's really the engine of the cell, sort of the capital of the cell, if you will. And one of the more important things it does, among the many important biochemical reactions that goes on in the mitochondria, is ATP production. So you can almost imagine that his heart failure is probably worsened by one of the drugs he was taking. He was on 2 forms of insulin, vitamin D, chloroquine, and the like. So we started with baseline lab tests. And before I go into details of the lab, we see him on the first day. We draw the blood for the lab. We don't get the results that day. We get some of the results the next day, et cetera. So we make medication changes, and we schedule to see him within 2 days. But we don't know the results of these labs. So we didn't know the results of this blood work on day 1 that we saw him. But when we saw him on day 3, I believe it was, his glucose 158, but look at his creatinine, 5.8. A normal creatinine you see here is less than 1, from 0.6 to 9.9. So he had very significant renal failure. His GFR was 14. I'll tell you about that in just a minute. So he was in a situation where you can argue that he needed urgent dialysis. His cholesterol was low. He was on a statin drug, and he was diabetic, and this shows evidence of insulin resistance. So our intervention took, the form of 4 parts. Now, we put him on a nutritional detox starting on day 1. He was on food level 0 to 4B. When we saw him back, we saw that creatinine of 5.08. We actually gave him intravenous fluids in the office. Now, he's a heart failure patient. Many doctors will tell you, well, you don't give heart failure patients IV fluids. Yes, you do if they need it, and he needed it. And so we stopped the diuretic. We had decreased it initially, but when we saw this creatinine, we stopped it, gave him a liter of IV fluids in the office. This is day 3 or 4. We saw him the next day, and I'll show you that creatinine. It was even higher because we hadn't hydrated him fast enough, and we had to put him in the hospital. So despite the fact that we weaned his medications, which I thought was aggressively, it wasn't aggressive enough initially. We had to put him in the hospital. We put him on food level 0 for 1 week period of time after that later on. So overall, the medication changes that occurred in his situation, we stopped the allopurinol because of the creatinine. We stopped the carvedilol, stopped the Tradjenta, stopped the Eliquis, everything except the vitamin D. We put him on another beta blocker that's not as harsh as this one. We kept him on the vitamin D, coenzyme Q10. This is a superfood. This is the algae that we talked about, and also the sea moss. We gave him lidoderm patch for his arthritis instead of the allopurinol. This worked very well for his arthritis in the scalp. So what happened to his number? The creatinine went from 5.08 all the way up to 12.8. That's severe renal failure. Look at the glomerular filtration rate. That's the rate in which the blood filters, the kidneys filter the blood. If you're below 15, that's where this red line is, you need dialysis. This is the line where you're declared to be end stage. He started off at 12, and before we were able to get him fully resuscitated, his GFR was well below end stage failure. But it was my clinical assessment that his kidneys had fully failed. It's just that he was severely dehydrated. So we aggressively hydrated him with lots of IV fluids. Now, many doctors wouldn't do this, but we put him in the hospital so we can observe him closely, watch his oxygen levels, but we hydrated him very, very aggressively. His creatinine went up. Notice that 60 is about normal. It went up to almost normal. Creatinine went down to 1.8. GFR went to 47. So his kidney function improved drastically. His functional status on day 1, now the blue bars represent the Bruce protocol stress test. It's a little bit more aggressive protocol, and the modified Bruce is a little bit easier. On day 1, he was only able to walk for 1 minute. Within about 3 weeks, he was able to triple his time on the Bruce protocol. Similarly, in the modified Bruce, he was able to triple his time. So his functional status tripled over this period of time of detoxing and hydrating. His heart rate fluctuated a lot, but one thing I want to point out is the pre and post heart rate. There's a small difference between the pre and post heart rate. That means the resting heart rate is very high. He's not able to get it up too much because he was very volume depleted. When we got him volume depleted, the pre and post heart rate had a bigger differential in these two settings. So again, his functional status improved greatly by these parameters. This is to point out how weight is not the best parameter to look at. His weight fluctuated in many different ways, largely because, again, he was over-diuresed here. He was getting hydrated, so the weight went back up as it should have, came back down some, but this is a more of a hydrated weight as opposed, this is a dehydrated weight that dropped and he was over-hydrated there. Systolic blood pressure, again, the blood pressure numbers fluctuate in the setting of detox. I'm showing you this because, we oftentimes show the before and after numbers, and these things are pretty, but in the course of treating someone who's clinically ill, these numbers can look pretty ugly because they bounce around a lot because the person's undergoing significant detox. Heart rate similarly can bounce around a lot. So again, here's a case where an individual is very acutely ill. We applied a nutritional regimen in the context of the standard medical therapies. We were able to wean him off a lot of his medication, especially this last patient, where weaning a lot of his medication probably had as much of an impact, or perhaps the greatest impact on his health compared to anything else that we did. Let's look at some of our clinical data just to show you some of the science behind this. I'm going to show you a lot of these slides just so you can have it. And then if you want to take a picture of it, and some of these slides are pretty busy, so I'm not going to go through all the details. But essentially what we did is we showed that a defined plant-based diet, and then the emphasis on defined, because just to say eat plants or eat vegan is not accurate enough for a lot of patients. But a defined plant-based diet utilizing an outpatient cardiovascular clinic effectively treats hypercholesterolemia, hypertension, and reduces medications. And so, you know, if someone comes in my office with blood pressure 160 over 100 and cholesterol of 200 and they're not on any medications, they say, well, can I try the nutrition first or do I have to start with medication? Based on our scientific evidence, you can safely do this with a nutritional regimen if you do it the right way. And this was a study, it was in 31 patients. What I want to do is point this out as the food classification system. You can read through the details yourself, but level 0 is raw, liquidated foods, cold pressed juices, smoothies, water, some algae. 1 through 3 are raw solid foods, 1 low glycemic index, 3 high glycemic index, 2's in the middle. 4, A, B, and C, there's a transition zone at level 4. 4A are high fat raw foods. 4B are dehydrated foods, not heated above, say, 140 degrees on a dehydrator. 4C are foods that are lightly blanched. 5 and 6 are cooked plant foods, but we emphasize boiling and steaming and relatively low temperature warming in an oven. We don't recommend sauteing in olive oil. You can saute in water. That's equivalent to steaming. Sauteing in olive oil, we equate that to, you know, deep frying in oil. We don't recommend, we recommend against microwaving. I've seen a lot of patients come in with a whole food plant-based diet, microwave a lot of their food, we take microwaving away. And some of the heavy grilling and things like that, we take away. 7, 8, 9, and 10, we don't recommend, but I classified just for the sake of context. And you can see that there in the slide. These are the changes in the food that patients had. The overall, this is roughly a 20% fat diet, but all of the fats are raw. Any food that's greater than 20% fat per caloric intake has to be raw. And I think that's the benefit of our diet. It allows for seeds, some nuts on some occasions, but the fats have to be raw. And you can see a large increase in the leafy greens and the like. So what did we find? We saw that a hemoglobin A1C, now this population were individuals who had high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and were overweight. We did not target diabetics, but as it turned out, on average, they were in the pre-diabetic range, hemoglobin A1C 5.9. Despite having hemoglobin A1C not being super high, we saw a 3.4% reduction in hemoglobin A1C, which was statistically significant. This was not a surprise to me. I've been seeing this for over 20 years in our patient population. We measured this data. We just now published it. Even though hemoglobin A1C is an average of blood sugar over 3 months, we were able to show a reduction in 1 month, and largely because the other thing that affects hemoglobin A1C are the fluctuations in blood sugar. So I think what we were saying is the reduction in postprandial blood sugars and therefore reduction in blood sugar fluctuations. And I think that's why we got the reduction in hemoglobin A1C in such a short period of time. C-reactive protein, again, I've been seeing this for nearly 20 years, 30% reduction in C-reactive protein. And this is why you're seeing some of the rapid changes acutely in a lot of our patients, because inflammation is being reduced so rapidly. Blood pressure drops initially, plateaus. The diastolic blood pressure drops, it bounces up a little bit. This week 3, I think, is representing a detox reaction. That's why the blood pressure goes up a little bit before it comes back down. On average, total medication about 2.6 went down by 1.6 by week 4, significant, about a 40% medication reduction overall. The other inflammatory markers that we saw, lipoprotein(a), we were the first to show a reduction in lipoprotein(a) with nutrition. This is a hard molecule to control. There are some medication, not a lot of medication, that reduces lipoprotein(a). We saw a 16% reduction in LP(a) in about 4 weeks on our nutritional regimen. Other lipid panels were reduced. Weight, of course, went down by 6%. We've been seeing this for nearly 2 decades. Total cholesterol went down. We've been seeing that for nearly 2 decades as well. CRP, as I said before, 30% reduction. Now, cytokines were reduced. Now, people know about cytokine storms because of recent COVID pandemic. We see evidence that cytokines are reduced. We have an upcoming study that's going to look at this more closely. Myeloperoxidase was reduced almost, it trended down. White blood count. Now, one thing I'm going to mention here, the white blood count on average was quote unquote normal at 6.3. The range is from like 3.3 to about 10. And 6.3 is normal, but notice of a significant reduction. My theory is that people walking with so-called normal white counts are elevated because of increased inflammation, but another sign that the white count going down as well as the neutrophils, these are all signs of reduction in inflammation. Is really important finding. So I'm going to stop there, and I really want to thank you for your attention again on a Sunday afternoon for all of us now. And I don't know. I don't know if we take questions or not, Gwyn, but I'll let you take over.
Okay.
I'll stop the share.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Montgomery. That's very compelling information. And I think, you know, anyone that's gone into a doctor's office has experienced things. So I think the benefit of your perspective on how they get moved through the system and your recommendations, I think are really very interesting.
Thank you.
It's 1:17, so we can take probably one or two questions if you're okay with that.
I'm fine.
Let's see, there's a question about microwaving. Can you share anything about what why y'all came up with the recommendation of no microwaving?
Yeah, there's not a lot of data that I'm aware of microwaving. I know that, you know, some other individuals in the plant-based environment may think differently. There was, I recall an article in British Journal of Medicine in 1989 that, and I think it was a fairly limited study, but they looked at microwaving and they saw that certain nutrients were turned into toxins when they underwent microwaving. It's not a natural way of warming food up. And so I don't think there's enough data to be absolutely definitive about it. But what I will say is, in my clinical experience, plus that one paper, I see patients who come in a whole food plant-based diet, no oil and the like. And microwaving is one of the main things they're doing, you know, cooking their foods. And when we remove that, we see significant changes. So it's one of those things where, okay, if I'm wrong, fine. But I think it's nothing that's going to hurt you to eliminate microwaving. And from our perspective, we're seeing people who are coming in and they're on their last leg. And so we have to remove everything that could be a problem. And so that's really part of a perspective thing, as well as some anecdote and limited literature that I've seen. More work, I think, needs to be done to kind of definitively say, hey, is it a problem or not? But I would put 50 cents on the fact that if we did a study, it would show it not to be good.
Okay. I see a question about mostly plant-based reversing osteoporosis. You know, it's sort of interesting. I think when Dr. Esselstyn has been at our location and someone say, I'm 95% on your diet, they'll go, 95% is not my diet. You know, my diet is 100% this. If you want to remove the inflammation, then take out the animal products. Colin, I see that you're still out there. Would you like to, I'm going to open it up to the three of you and see if anyone else would like to ask any questions.
Okay, I'm muted, yes. I'm sorry, I unmuted myself. Did you ask me a question, I think? Yeah. Well,
let's see, I was just mentioning that if anyone we have the opportunity for both of you here.
Okay.
Gwen, I have a question.
Please type in the chat bar and then we'll raise it, please.
I don't have the ability to do that right now. That's okay.
All right, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, what was the name of the patch for the arthritis?
Lidoderm patch.
Thank you.
About the 95% just comment. I mean, I think it's an important point for people to know that especially if you have a chronic illness that you're trying to reverse, you have to be very precise. And we have a little, saying I tell my patients: not a bite, not a drop, not a crumb. And again, my perspective is one where, people come in and they have pretty significant illness. I'm treating a patient now who, has heart failure, and she was really end stage. I took her to the hospital, severe mitral valve disease, and my colleague was supposed to do a mitral valve clipping procedure with the help of the heart failure. And another colleague I asked to do a biventricular pacemaker implant. Both said she's just too far gone. There's just remove care and let her die. She was on a melanoma drip. So I just detoxed. We put on smoothies and blue-green algae, raw kale. The nutrition I had on those feeds, we pull that out. So that's killing her. And I had on melanoma. I was able to wean her off the melanoma very quickly. And again, back to some of those graphs that I show, these things can happen very quickly. I had just a week to wean her off the melanoma, and I was able to get off melanoma. We sent her home to a nursing home into hospice care. She wasn't there for about less than 2 days. She's now home. I talked to her yesterday. How are you feeling? Wonderful. And so we're getting her physical therapy, and we're going to continue to detox her. But I expect her to fully recover. I told her, look, you're going to recover. You just got to follow this regimen. And I have a number of other patients, a 42-year-old man who flew down from Southern Illinois, and again, we say, look, we'll put an LVAD in you, but to make you comfortable, but you're going to die. We detox him, wean him from his melanoma, and he turns around. So it's a very slippery slope with these patients, because you can't do 95%. You can't do 99.99999%. You have to do 100%, because a bite, drop, or crumb can just tip you over the edge.
If I can make a comment on another line, Baxter, am I on?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I've often wondered about that question a lot. That question about, do we have to be 100%? Yes, of course, on ethical grounds, we have to. On scientific grounds, I would argue that's the best. On medical grounds, I guess the best. Here's the question. We like to see people just go the whole way, just go there, stay there, realize how good it is, and leave it at that. But it's also very hard for everybody to get there. I don't know how to tackle that other than the fact that to try to get people to realize that if they stay on it really carefully, for at least 30 days, 2 weeks, 2 months maybe, or more, their taste preferences change. And when they get there, then it's so much easier. And I have the impression of interest in your comments on that, Dr. Montgomery. Is that 1 to 2 months? If you can get people there to stay there really rigidly and carefully, do you think that they're there then for good?
Well, it's not so much that they're for good, but I think the point you made is that your taste preferences change. So there's one category of patients who are very, very sick, and we have no room, they're on the tight wire. So that category, you absolutely have to be perfect, and oftentimes those people are incentivized to do that. I'm gonna put them aside. But let's take the average person with a chronic illness and it's not so acute. That person, let's say we put them on a program and say, let's do it 80%, have meatless Mondays or have a cheat day, et cetera, et cetera. It's my argument that that program is more difficult than the 100%. In fact, if someone comes and says, well, can I just eat some bean soup or whatever? I said, no, I want you on grass and water, raw juice for 4 weeks, 100%. Because what happens is that when they struggle through that 4 weeks, their taste buds change, but there's a psychological change toward food, the preferences. So when they come back, they love steamed broccoli, they love bean soups, all that stuff. These become delectable, these become new steak. I just led a group of individuals through a 30-day juice feast, and many of them had never done a juice feast before. Many were not vegan, some were just vegan, junk food vegan, et cetera. And the experience was amazing. And we did, group sessions and talks and what have you. And when they came out, I said, gosh, just a salad tastes so much better and so on. So our argument is that if they're here, I try to push them here for a finite period of time. It's not forever, it's finite. Everybody will say, well, what do I do for the rest of my life? Don't worry about the rest of your life. Give me 4 weeks and we will get you through this process. Because we're not dealing with, I tell my patients, I'm not trying to cure your diabetes. I'm not trying to cure your heart failure, your high blood pressure, or your high cholesterol. I'm trying to cure your desire for bad food. That's your ultimate illness, your desire for bad food. If we can eradicate your desire for bad food, then you're healed. So the issue is, then how do we address that? It's a psychological issue, it's tactical, there's close follow-up. So we say, look, if it's elective, you mark the time on the calendar, and we're going to start that day. You choose the date. And when we're ready to start, we're going to go all out for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever time we say. And we see them every week. We talk to them, et cetera. We talk them through it. And so when they get to that process, it's a sense of accomplishment, a sense of achievement. They feel better about themselves. And it's not like they never go back. A lot of people do regress. But when they regress, they hate it. The food doesn't taste as good. They feel sicker. But even the ones who regress the most, they always know how great they felt during that 4 to 6 week period of time when they were 100%. And that's always in their mind. That doesn't go away. And it's like a high of a different type. It's sort of like you take crack on you. So then they want to come back to that, no matter how long it may take them to get back to that. Most people, their diets improve and it stays better over time. So if I want you to run 10 miles, then I'm going to say run a marathon, because you'll at least get to 10 miles. If you only get halfway, you've gone more than 10 miles. And so that's the argument there. So we don't cut any slack. We said, look, moderation kills, moderation torture. Let's be serious. You're here because of a reason. I'm here because of a reason. Let's not play around with this. And many people adopt that message and adopt it wholeheartedly, because food addiction is really, you don't tell an alcohol drink martinis once a week. You say stop.
I'll second that, Baxter. With the, I look at the food addiction as the same as cigarette smoking. If you try to reduce it and not quit it, then people retain that desire to keep smoking. But when you can eradicate it entirely, food preferences change. And we see with the 21-day kickstart, where we're giving people food and making it easy for people just to follow a plan by eating the food, and they feel better, then people recognize that that's the real path. But if you're just cutting back, it may prevent you from getting chronic illnesses, but it's never going to reverse the chronic illnesses the same, with the same impact that you show. It's really when you're diagnosed with a chronic illness, then you're trying to undo decades worth of indulging, and you really need to be eating for your life.
Yeah, that's a good point. The decades, you're trying to make up for a lot of years the years of bad lifestyle, not just the eating, but other aspects of bad lifestyle, is deep-seated, embedded deep in your tissues. And it's like remodeling a house. You got to tear it down and rebuild it. And that tearing down process can be pretty intricate and pretty elaborate.
So there's a question about air fryers, and I know one of the things that we talk about in the Kickstart classes is that when you're heating starches over 350 degrees, they develop acrylamides, which can be carcinogenic. And so, at GreenFare, the oven, we're in the slow food movement. The oven never goes over 350 degrees. And I think, as Baxter said, eating, a significant amount of raw food every day is beneficial as well.
And, and I like to chime in on that. I want to throw a question out at my colleague, Dr. Campbell, because, I'm impressed with what you say in the book, Whole. And, the question has come in my mind, and I think we probably need to do some scientific studies. Is an overly cooked food whole? Because, in theory, you're going to break certain things down. Some people say, you read some articles, well, the beta carotenes in cooked carrots are more pronounced, the higher beta carotene. But what other nutrients that are less pronounced when it's cooked?
That's a good question.
Huh?
Yeah, it's a good question. What you just said, is it a little bit of cooking okay as compared to overly cooked food? You said overly cooked food. I mean, obviously, overly cooked food is going to destroy some nutrients and that sort of thing. So you don't have the whole food really. But I don't like to be too hard nosed about this on the basis of the science, at least. That I know, for example, that 100% is better than 100%. Let's say raw food is better than 90% or something of that sort. I'm not sure I can really defend that on the basis of real evidence on it, because that's kind of a behavioral thing and a practical thing. So we work toward that. If we just, I happen to know some people who, surprisingly, who stayed whole food very religiously and got into trouble with it. You may have seen that, but I don't know. I like to call it a goal, not an absolute, you're a really bad person if you don't get there kind of thing. Here's the goal. Here's what the science sort of suggests we should be. And then just work toward that end. And
I agree. Everybody is not very sick. Again, I preface my statements on arguably I have a very skewed perspective. People with very acute illnesses, and we're starting to see people with cancer and heart disease and lupus. I mean, they've got a lot of things. And so, you're just faced with all of these things, and you just, maybe it makes, I'm probably going to grow horns and come out, with smoke. It hardens you, but you're right. I think, we have to recognize that, okay, think of it as an asymptotic line. But I think it just depends on what your purpose are and your goals are and what your situation is. And the more urgent your situation is, the more aggressive you have to be. Right. And the less urgent, then you have some wiggle room early on to learn this lifestyle.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to run, Gwen. I got my thing on. I got some people waiting, and so.
All right, very good. Well, I think we had planned to go to 1:30, so I appreciate again very deeply you and Baxter for taking time out on Sunday, and I appreciate everybody who tuned in to join us today. Please visit GreenFare Café, and we'll send the recording out. So if you signed up through Eventbrite, I think which everybody did, we'll send copies of the presentation out so you can either watch again or share questions. So Colin, you and Baxter, enjoy your day, and I hope everybody gets out and enjoys the wonderful spring weather today. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.